At this point, we'll open things up for questions, but I just want to make one brief announcement, and that is that joining us today in the audience are Leeds scholars who are mid-career police practitioners who are particularly interested in bringing evidence and integrating research into police departments. So I'm not going to introduce them all by name, but we are building a community of police scholars to help us with this work. And on that note, I'd like to open things up for questions. I want to remind people to come up to the mic, introduce themselves, and where they're from. Well, then I'm going to start with a question. And I'd like to start with Susan on this, although I'd like everyone to comment on this. I didn't recognize this when I introduced her, but Susan was actually part of a panel with the Institute of Medicine that several years ago put together a report on the state of research in with respect to firearm violence and injuries and the research gaps. And I'd like to ask all of the panelists, but starting with Susan, what they believe are the priority areas where we really need to begin to focus our research investments.
Thank you, Howard, for mentioning that. There's so many different places that we need work. I think the markets is certainly one. But I also think we need to look broadly at, as I'm trying to do, the non-fatal use of guns. The homicide rates have dropped precipitously in the United States, and nobody's able to really completely understand why that is. Homicide by intimate partners has dropped substantially since it started being recorded systematically in 1976 through the Department of Justice. And if we try to explain that, there are a lot of broad factors that are going on, and some of them might have to do with guns, maybe not, because gun sales have skyrocketed at the same time. So I think there are a lot of questions out there, but I think we need to really expand our focus beyond homicide and to these non-fatal uses. Thanks.
So the IOM report and the National Research Council report laid out the recommendations for research, and so here are a couple of areas I think both of them agreed on and still are issues. One is some of the reasons research, other than funding, which is a problem, and we need more of that, of course, and every agency could do that. But there is these huge data problems that we have in this area that are not unique to crime, to other crimes, but with regards to guns, it is just difficult to access those data sets that are there, and when you do, they are of, they have things that are missing, gaps in them that we need. So data and focusing on data, I think, is important. Second, police departments around the country and I get a chance through my work at IEC, with IECP, I'm not employed there, of course, and with PERF, a chance to see some of this up close, are experimenting with ways to address gun crime, and we don't know much about how effective they are. And I think a program of research that would first document what police are doing and then try to, just like Prince George's County is doing with task forces. We don't have much research, if any, on gun fusion centers and how well they're working and what are best models. So that's the second area. And then third, I think the markets that we've just touched on in this project, that kind of work needs to continue, and I would hope NIJ and other agencies might see some value in enhancing work in this field.
So I've been in academia a long time and done lots of different areas, and I've just never seen an area such as gun violence where data are purposely not collected. The CDC, for example, refuses to put a gun question on their behavioral risk factor surveillance system survey. 250,000 people a year are questioned about all sorts of things about health, and that's the one place where we could get good data on the percent of households with guns by state, for example. There's also lots of areas where we collect data where researchers aren't able to get the data. So, for example, the concealed carry permits from the state information is really hard for researchers to get data from ATF. There's a whole lot of areas where it'd be great to do research. And then finally, I've never seen an area where there's so little money for research. The CDC is afraid to say the word guns. The ATF is, trying to do something, but it's tiny, tiny money. The NIH has done incredibly little. Foundations are afraid to do anything because they don't want the hassle. Even people, like my goal in life is to put my questions on other people's surveys, and I can put all sorts of injury questions on people's surveys, but if I try to put a gun question, researchers in other areas are afraid to put a gun question on because of the hassle they may receive. So it's just one of the big problems is that if we're going to have lots of guns, we need a harm reduction approach, and we know so incredibly little about how to reduce harm. And you can just go through a litany of, what we don't know. There's virtually no studies on open carry. There's virtually no studies on gun theft. There's virtually no studies on gun training. There's virtually no studies that you name it. You pick the topic, and I talk to reporters all the time, and I can tell them broad things, and then when they start digging, I say, well, there's sort of one study that was done 10 years ago, which isn't quite on topic, but it's sort of a little bit, you learn a little something, and that's it. And no place else in academia do I believe is like this.
I'll be very brief. Those are important perspectives. My perspective is always coming back to prevention, and all of the things that we just spoke about are sort of downstream indicators once the gun is in hand. Dr. Joe Wright over at Howard University Hospital is our health officer in Prince George's County. One of the things that we're interested in is the impacts of chronic stress on youth. And that comes back around to how we can use this T&I initiative to alleviate that chronic stress in some of these environments, and the nexus between that chronic stress and the acting out behaviors that lead them to the place where they're looking for the gun. Because I think if we have better understood those dynamics, those environmental dynamics in communities, then we might be able to find that interrupter that prevents that progressing to the place where the gun, the robbery, the shooting, those kinds of things become attractive options.
Nancy Rodriguez, Director of NIJ. So my question actually is related to that, Chief. And David alluded to and presented, obviously, data on the very divergent perspectives among subpopulations regarding views of the police, and especially around trust. So how do we begin, or how is this particular climate really complicating and making it more difficult for us to even have citizens and the public feel that they can convey to agents of the system elements around firearms and their use? And are there strategies? I guess my second point would be, are there strategies that you're aware of in various local jurisdictions that are maybe trying to kind of counter and maybe capitalize on certain subpopulations that may be more vulnerable, whether it be children, whether it be women?
I was part of a forum yesterday to respond to your question, addressing some of those concerns. And the example that I've been using publicly recently is, if I were to give you $333, you'd have a significant sum of money, and you could feed yourself, you could feed someone else, you could clothe yourself, you could get yourself some shelter. If I gave you $1, there's not a lot you can do. There's 333 million people in America, and there's less than 1 million police officers. And overwhelmingly, those police officers do good work day in and day out. My interactions with our community are overwhelmingly positive, but it's the hard work of small things. And that's where I try on every opportunity in those forums with my community to come back to the T&I initiative, because what T&I really does is that multidisciplinary approach that builds credibility of government. Because my own experiences in the city of Baltimore and elsewhere are that people aren't exclusively reacting to policing. They're reacting to governance. You know, a protest is done because you believe that government will address your grievances. Riots are a product of a lack of faith in the governance. And so I think there's a really promising strategy there, and I've seen others. But again, it's the hard work of small things. And when people know you care about them, it makes a huge difference. And that's a difficult message in the context of a national narrative that does not, I think, represent the vast majority of police officers or the vast majority of police interactions by focusing on a small subset of things that, frankly, shouldn't have happened. I'll be honest about that. But the other way I illustrate that is to say that, you know, and I'm frank with my community, I always have been. You know, we don't go to the airport now and fear that the captain of our aircraft is going to deliberately crash that aircraft. But that's happened in the last few years. And what we in policing see in some of these instances is that deliberate, poor choice. But it doesn't reflect the vast majority of men and women, federal, state, and local officers who go out there and risk their lives every day for complete strangers. And balancing that, I think, is one of the things that I try to do as a leader so that people do understand where our hearts and our minds are.
Let me just add two quick things to that, because I agree with those comments. But around the area of gun violence, I don't see in the research literature that police have a difficult time when they approach it seriously gaining community support and involvement. And you could start back as long ago as Operation Ceasefire in Boston, where the police worked closely with community leaders to develop what turned out to be, and is still, I think, one of the few well-established programs that can reduce gun violence with community involvement. And the second point would be, in gun violence, the key crime for me, and I think for many people, is homicide. And while we've had this dramatic decline in homicides in recent years, we've had also a decline in homicide clearances. There are estimated over 200,000 homicides since 1980 that haven't been cleared. And these tend to be in segments of the community that we think have the greatest distrust and lack of faith in the police department. And I think, with no evidence at all, that part of it is their observation of the many, many people in their communities who are killed and for which nothing seems to be done. So I think a focus on community outreach, the kind of thing Prince George's County and other jurisdictions are doing, and a focus on clearing homicides could help chip away at this issue of trust and confidence.
Lieutenant Tarek McGuire, Arlington, Texas Police Department. I'm an NIJ scholar. I spoke with Mr. Welford the other day over the phone, an IACP fellow. I have a two-part question, one for the chief. You talked about systemic issues reference guns being brought into your community. That question is, one, where are those guns coming from? And then second to the panel, is there any research to support that collecting more guns or taking more guns off the street leads to a reduction in violent offenses in communities?
Well, part of what we're trying to answer is that very question, which is why we're collaborating with Dr. Welford. But what we're finding and what we found anecdotally prior to getting to a place where we could do real research on that was a lot of those are coming through a handful of individuals who are buying them en masse in other places, importing them, and they are a shadow organization or a shadow network, if you will. The criminal fraternity knows that if they want a gun, these are the handful of people they can go to get it. And that comes back to the strategic component of this being that by tracing those who pull the trigger back to the person who supplied them with the firearm, those folks haven't come under scrutiny before. This work is an effort between ourselves and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to find those individuals and to hold them accountable. And again, the calculus there is that we can change the behavior of people who find trading in illegal guns appealing and thereby reduce the number of guns and the number of instances of violence.
I don't want to talk too much, but just to comment on the second part of your question, I don't know of any evidence that links reductions in guns to reduction through police efforts reductions in crime, partly because there's been so little effort. You can't do the research unless that it actually is happening, where police are making a strong effort to reduce and actually can demonstrate that reduction. So I think it's an open question empirically, but logically it just makes perfect sense to me. If you had a community with no guns, I think there'd be less gun crime.
And I agree entirely. And there is a lot of evidence that where there's more guns, there's more death. And actually, interestingly, where there is some good evidence is that reducing guns has been shown to reduce suicide.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant McGillis from Milwaukee Police Department. I'm also one of the lead scholars. Back in my home agency, I'm actually a use of force firearms guy. And kind of the elephant in the room, the political lobby of certain organizations in relationship to gun violence is something that is a barrier. Using science and research, talking about trace and tracking and prisoner interviews, has it ever been investigated to use IBIS or NIBIN technology on the front end of tagging guns at the point of purchase or prior to purchase? Well, those guns are out in society where we know if they're linked to crimes, they can help us on the tail end to solve it. Understanding that the deck is very much stacked against that, any type of legislation.
That hasn't been our focus up to this point because of the whole issue of gun registries and those sorts of, as you point out, large political questions. And our focus right now is on creating results. I'm not going to suggest that there isn't value to having any conversation, because that's the whole point of research. But our focus has not been there. Our focus has been on the work that Dr. Welfer is doing and on the initiatives that I've mentioned.
There was an effort in Maryland with the bullet stamping. So there was a requirement that every gun that was sold, there had to be a bullet retained that would have the information be entered into a database. There was quite a bit of dissatisfaction politically when that was passed, and when it didn't produce many hits in a short period of time, which I think the people supporting it knew it wouldn't happen. You have to build that database up. It was removed, and so we don't have it. But I think there is interest. It's just the political difficulty of achieving any of those.
Good afternoon. I'm Phelan Wyrick with the National Institute of Justice. Chief Stilinski, you've described how you brought an emphasis on research to the operations and strategies of the Prince George's Police Department. Can you say a little more about how you're working to weave that orientation into the operations and the culture of the department so that it can survive beyond your tenure?
That work began under Chief McGaw, and I took the lead on a number of those initiatives, particularly in patrol. I'll say it this way. We used to structure 30-day initiatives or 2-week initiatives, and we'd launch them and we'd see how they went. Right now, we run the department in real time. And so every commander understands, how I interpret this. And let me be frank to this. This data is very important. This data reflects the effectiveness of a law enforcement agency for a community. But the thing that's most important about this data to me, it reflects the safety of my officers. Because the fewer violent crimes that are occurring in Prince George's County, it's the fewer opportunities for them to be facing someone with a gun or a knife. So I'm invested in driving these numbers down for their safety and the community's safety. That's that thinking comprehensively piece. And I'll suggest that you would have a tough time stepping away from how we do that, because culturally, people see the value. Nobody gets into law enforcement to fail. We want to succeed. And again, the finest people I know overwhelmingly want to help. And so if you use these methods that we've been championing, if you run the department in real time, if you are nimble in the way you deploy resources and you move and you can see those results, it feeds itself. It's not something that they do, I believe, at this point because I or Chief McGaw said we have to do it this way. They're adopting these methods because they see value in it and they're having success with it. And quite frankly, the greatest satisfaction I have is watching people innovate now and come up with better ways to do it. Because at the end of this process, none of this is done. Nike had a great slogan a few years ago, there is no finish line. We're never going to perfect policing. It's got to constantly evolve. So what we do successfully now has a shelf life of a year or maybe 18 months. The question is, what's the next thing? And constantly encouraging people throughout the department to be looking at how we do it and come up with a better way.
I think we've run out of time at this point. I want to thank David and Charles and Susan and Hank for some incredibly good presentations and a lot to think about. I'd like you all to join me in thanking them once more.